Welcome, welcome, one and all. Hopefully there's more all than one to Mr. Restaurant. I am Mr. Restaurant. I am Will Knox. This is Mr. Restaurant show number 1. Why Mr. Restaurant? Well, I asked that question for many, many years, and I was wondering, me being in the restaurant real estate and concept development business, shouldn't there be a show on the air, maybe a podcast, a radio show, maybe a live show along the lines of the old Charlie Rose interview program, where we would really sit down and talk with those who are involved in the business of restaurants, not necessarily the cuisine, but those people who are really behind the scenes and sometimes in front, who really make the restaurant business go. And it's intrigued me for some time. So finally, I was asked by Jeremiah Higgins of the Jeremiah Show to come on board and be his restaurant correspondent. So what are we going to call this show? I thought to myself. Well, my son, my inimitable young son, who's 26 years old and pretty sharp, said, why don't you call yourself Mr. Restaurant, Dad, since that's what a lot of people call you. So I thought to myself, that's pretty good. And my wife, Wendy, who's a marketing guru, said, that's a great name. Let's go with that. So we're going to have fun with Mr. Restaurant, hopefully, and we're going to interview people who are coming from all walks of life in the restaurant business. And we're going to start out today with the true Mr. Restaurant, Bob Spivak. Bob Spivak is a legend in Southern California restaurants. And actually, he's gone nationwide. But better that Bob tell you the story than I do. So Bob, welcome to the first show of Mr. Restaurant, and welcome Bob Spivak, the true Mr. Restaurant. Welcome, Bob.
Hi, Will. Thank you so much. I'm excited and honored to be your first guest. So let's get started.
Well, let's get started and let's really tell the audience a little bit about how you started out in the business, and then we can just take it from there and kind of just jam a little bit.
Well, that's a long story. I don't know.
We've got time.
Okay. Well,
I'll cut you loose.
It goes back 70 years. My father had a restaurant in Sherman Oaks, suburb of Los Angeles, called Smokey Joe's. And it was about 5 blocks from my grammar school. And so every day after school, I would walk over to Smokey Joe's. And my job was to fold napkins and peel carrots. I did this for a couple of years and finally went to my father one day and said, I've been doing these napkins and carrots for a long time. I'd like to do something a little bit more adult and a little bit more necessary. I told him I'd like to become the dishwasher. And he was a little bit afraid to have his 10-year-old son work around all the equipment in the kitchen. So they drew a line on the wall in the kitchen, said when I grew to that height, I could become the dishwasher. So I don't know how many kids you know that aspired to become a dishwasher, but I've definitely.
I did it for about a day.
Yeah, well, I did it. I was so proud. When you work for your father, you do one of two things. You either don't work very hard because you can't get replaced, or you work twice as hard as anybody else to prove that you got the job because you deserved it and not because you were the owner's son. And I guess you can figure out which one I was. So I continued washing dishes until I was about 14, when I put on a coat and tie and became a host in the restaurant. And when I was 16, my father bought me a green 1952 Oldsmobile. And my job was to drive about 20 miles downtown to where he had a commissary and pick up the barbecue and bring it back to the restaurants. And one day I went there to pick up the barbecued beans, and they had run out of 1-gallon jars that they always packed them in. So they packed it in a 3-gallon milk can. Those of you who are
these came in actual jars, glass jars.
Well, they didn't come in glass jars. They packed them in glass jars. They used glass jars from from all the other raw ingredients that they were using. They weren't about to go out and buy glass jars in those days. So this 3-gallon milk can, those of you who are younger than Will and myself might know what a milk can looks like, but it stands about 3 feet tall, has a very wide neck, and that's where they transported milk, what they used to use to transport milk. So they filled it full of barbecued beans, put the lid on, wired the lid shut, laid it on its side in the trunk of my 1952 Oldsmobile, and off I went. And when I got to the restaurant, I opened up the trunk, and yeah, you guessed it. The lid had come off, and the trunk was 4 inches deep in barbecued beans.
Wow.
Now I looked around, and
Now what?
What I would think any 16-year-old would do. I looked around, nobody was watching, so I started scooping the beans back in the can. Just about this time, this woman walked by, and she looked, and then she's, wow, I always wondered how they delivered those barbecued beans. She actually thought they filled my trunk with beans, and I put them in the can at each stop. So this was kind of an auspicious beginning to my restaurant career. And by the way, we never got the smell of the beans out of the car, and finally had to junk the car just to get away from that smell. So,
Do you have an aversion to beans now?
I beg your pardon?
Do you dislike beans now as a result?
No, as a matter of fact, I love barbecued beans.
Oh, I guess you're partial.
Barbecue, period, because it just always reminds me of my father. I was very close with him. He was a terrific restaurateur in terms of designing restaurants and product. He was really good in product.
Is someone calling for a reservation right now at your house?
Yeah, probably. He was not that strong in the financial end of restaurants, but that we'll talk about a little bit later. So I continued to work for him. Now, it turned out that I had very, very severe learning disabilities and had a real difficult time in school. As a matter of fact, if it wasn't for an athletic career, I probably never would have graduated from high school. So when I got out of school, I didn't have a lot of opportunity, so I went in the restaurant business, which is one of the few businesses that you can excel in without having a great education. I worked for my father for about 7 or 8 years. In that time, I got married, had 2 children, and all of a sudden I went to work one day, and the IRS had padlocked the door, and he was.
What were you doing with him though over those 7 years?
Well, anything and everything.
Chief cook and bottle washer.
Yeah, anything and everything that you could do in a restaurant. You know, I've already told you I had the dishwashing career. I worked
Right.
with I was a prep cook, and then when I was about 18, I was the breakfast cook. As a matter of fact, on November 22nd, 1963, I pulled into the parking lot of the Smokey Joe's to cover my my shift, my breakfast shift in the kitchen when it was announced that President Kennedy had been shot. So that's a very vivid memory in my mind, November 22nd, 1963. And then my father had a restaurant downtown called the Redwood. And this was a very exciting place. It was next to the LA Times. And all the reporters would come in, bring their Olivetti typewriters onto the bar, hunt and peck for stories while they were drinking their Manhattans. And there was a phone behind the bar, extension 1200, which was a direct line from the LA Times to the bar. And whenever the red phone would ring, the bartender would answer the phone, Redwood, and the voice on the other end would be an editor looking for one of his writers. And so it would ask one of the writers was Art Ryan. So it would ask, cover up the phone and say, Art, are you here? And I would go, no, I'm not here. And we'd say, nope, sorry, he's not there, and hang up the phone. That was code for Art to go running up to that his editor was looking for.
Was he supposed to bring a martini with him when he went home? Back to the office?
But they were Manhattans that they were drinking.
Manhattan.
But if your office happened to be on the second floor, which was right above the restaurant, if you pounded on the floor 3 times, the bartender made a Manhattan because he knew one of the writers was coming down.
That's cool. That's a good idea.
It was, yeah. And then, of course, there's the story that one day, actually, it was the first day that my father entrusted me with running the restaurant without him being there. And just before opening at 11 in the morning, I get a rap on the door, and I go and I open the door, and this frantic man is asking for my father. And I said, gee, I'm sorry he's not here, but can I help you? He says, I hope so. He says, my name is Frank Cohen, and my brother is Mickey Cohen. Well, for those of you, again, who are younger than Willie.
Very infamous. Yes.
Mickey Cohen was the head of the mafia in Los Angeles. And as a matter of fact, when Meyer Lansky sent Bugsy Siegel to open up the Flamingo in Las Vegas, Bugsy had to come to LA and get Mickey's approval before he could do it, because that was part of Mickey's territory. So his brother goes on to explain to me that Mickey has been in federal prison for about 6 years. He was beat up, paralyzed. He's brought a lawsuit against the United States government, and they had brought him to Los Angeles for the trial. So he goes on to tell me, so that my brother is in custody, but he's technically not in prison, and so he can eat outside food for the first time in 6 years. So Frank Cohen goes on to tell me that he wants me to give him 3 of the largest New York steaks I can find, medium rare, and then he would like 3 baked potatoes, 3 orders of lyonnaise potatoes, 3 orders of mashed potatoes. He said, give me 3 orders of broccoli, steamed broccoli, and 3 orders of cream spinach. And then I'll take 3 pieces of apple pie, 3 pieces of chocolate cake, and 3 of
That's all American, if ever there was.
Sure, and 3 of anything else that you can think of. I'll be back in a half hour to pick it up. So I go and tell the chef, don't fail me now. Forget the ends, just cut 3 big ones out of the center and give me 3 of this, 3 of that. Then I went to Alice behind the counter and told her I wanted the 3 chocolate cake, 3 apple pie. And I said, and give me 3 rice pudding. We're known for that. And got everything ready for me. So sure enough, a half hour later, there was probably 12 different bags, and I handed them all to Frank Cohen. He gave me a $100 bill. The bill was $85. Which if you think about $85 today, you're probably talking about $500.
That's a big bill.
Yeah, he gave me a $100 bill and told me to keep the change, and off he went. He wasn't gone 5 minutes when the chef says to me, Bob, when do you want these steaks? That's right. I gave him everything but the steaks.
Oh my gosh.
So I said,
I'm glad you're still alive to tell the story.
I said, I'll take the steaks now. And he put them on a big tray. Put a napkin over the tray. I carried the tray out, hailed a cab, told him to take me to federal courthouse and make it fast. And I got there and I ran up the stairs and I found the bailiff and I told him the story. He chuckled, picked the napkin up off of the steaks and saw that there were no knives or guns or anything. He says, follow me. And we go up to the 5th floor of the federal courthouse, which is a maze of cells. It looks just like you see it in the movies. And we're walking down rows and rows of cells, guys hanging on the bars. And we get to one and the bailiff takes out a ring of keys, puts it in, opens the door, pushes me in, slams the door shut. And you hear this clink, clink, clink. And here I am, just me and Mickey. I got there before his brother.
Aye.
So he's looking at me baffled. And I looked at him and I said, well, Mr. Cohen, your brother came. I was looking for my father. It turns out Mickey Cohen had gone to junior high school with my father, who we called.
It's all in the family then.
Yeah, we called him Eddie, but his original name was Sam. And so Mickey says, how's Sammy? And tell him I said hello. And so and he was so pleasant that I said to him, well, I have to tell you, Mr. Cohen, when the chef said, when do you want these steaks? My whole life flashed before me, and all I could think of was getting them to you. So here I am. And just about that time, his brother and his lawyer, who was Jack Dahlstrom, came in, and they looked at me like, what in the hell are you doing here? And so that's my story of having lunch with Mickey Cohen.
So from an exciting moment like that, where did you then kind of get the idea that you wanted to be your own boss?
Well, that came a lot later, Will. As I said, I worked for my father when I was about 28 years old with a wife and 2 children. His business was shut down and I had to go get a real job. So I went to work on the deli counter at a discount store called Fedco, which was kind of a modern day Costco. And I worked there for about 5 years, and I worked very hard. I worked my way up from a counterman to actually being in charge of the prepared foods for all 6 of their units, which were across Southern California. And then one day, the owner of Fedco Foods, it was a concession, and the owner came to me. He liked me very much. He said, you know, I know that you have a restaurant background, and I would like to open a restaurant, and I'd like you to help me. So we opened up a soup, salad, and sandwich buffet called Soup and Such. And it was kind of the forerunner to Soup Plantation, if you know that.
I was just going to say that it sounded like a soup plantation to me.
It was way before Soup Plantation. We had 32 different soups. We would give you a taste of them, and they were, you know, across the board from clam chowder to mulligan stew.
Was there an audience in LA for soup?
Yeah, there was not an audience that you would see in New York and colder climates, but there was. And then we had salads that were prepared salads on a dish on ice, and they were not very appetizing. And you kind of got the key when you said, was there a market for soup? Which there was, but there was a bigger market for salads, and our salads sucked. They really weren't very nice. And I went to Maury, who was my boss, and I went to Maury and I said, you know, we need to do a salad buffet. We need to do a salad bar. Now, they were unheard of in those days, although I will tell you, and Will, you know what I'm talking about, Bob Morris did have a salad bar in those days.
I think Bob Morris would be the first that really did the salad bar, correct?
Well, not only would be the first
Commercially.
but he'd be the best.
Right.
He was just great at that.
Well, we're going to have Bob on the show one day. Another Mr. Restaurant.
Definitely. Well, Maury had a meat background. Maury was a butcher, and he couldn't deal with the fact that you couldn't control what people took. He kept saying to me, well, Bob, how can you leave this open? How do you know that people aren't going to take more tomatoes, which cost a lot more than lettuce? And he just couldn't get his arms around not knowing specifically what the cost of goods sold would be. So we never did it. We opened 3 Soup and Suches.
You mean, so this was kind of a slipshod, you know, let's just go for it. And nobody really had any controls at that time and really weren't paying attention to cost of goods being X% of the overall.
No.
Was there attention paid to that exact number?
Yeah, actually quite the opposite. And this was the reason that Maury wouldn't go for a salad bar, because he couldn't contain the cost.
I see.
He could have an approximate cost, but he didn't know how many people were going to take more of the expensive items on it and less of the less expensive. And so, cost of goods sold and food costs in those days, all we talked about. That was all we talked about in terms of bottom line, was keeping the food costs down. Labor was very inexpensive. And this was a buffet, so it was even less expensive. So no, it was all based, and it was a good concept, but it failed. After we opened 3, the first one was in Beverly Hills, where Crustacean is today. Actually, that was a bank, and we turned it into a restaurant, and then Crustacean came along many years later. And then one in Westwood on Weyburn, across from what was then Bullock's Westwood. And the third one, which was the lemon of all, which was on Wilshire, just east of La Brea.
Well, you would have thought that would have worked very well over in that area. We're going to actually talk a little bit more about this, but I'm getting the high sign that in a couple of minutes, we're going to fade out and go to commercial. What do you think, Dr. D? Is that happening now?
I know.
Oh, I guess we can continue talking, Bob. Let's hear a little bit more, and then I'll get the high sign and we'll go to commercial.
So after opening that third one, I could see that we weren't going anywhere. I was working 6.5 days a week, probably 14 hours a day.
With 2 children and a wife.
With 2 children and a wife, and I wasn't making an awful lot of money. I was making
It's a good formula for a marriage.
I was making a living wage, but that was it. And the marriage was getting more and more difficult by the minute. And so I finally went to Maury and I said, I just don't think we're going anywhere. I got an offer from a guy who built our 3rd restaurant, a contractor who built our 3rd restaurant. And he thought that I represented a legitimate business businessman, and that I could help him get into restaurants and build restaurants. And so he offered me a job, and I went to Maury and I said, you know, I think I'm going to take it. It's a 9 to 5 kind of a job, and it's more money and whatever. And Maury agreed, and so so I left and I worked for the office construction company. And I was a fish out of water. I didn't know a nail from a screw, and I just wasn't for me. So I had a year contract, and it was a lot of money. I was making pretty good money then. Year contract, I could see that it wasn't going past that, and so the year came up, the job disintegrated, and I now was basically out of work again. And so I had a cousin, actually a cousin of my mother's, contemporary of my mother's, who had a 500-acre ranch in Santa Barbara growing organic vegetables. And he again looked at me like a substantial businessman that could give him some credibility.
This was an organic ranch.
An organic vegetable.
It was ahead of its time.
Well, yeah, it was. Although you remember Madam, I don't remember her name. I'll think of it in a second.
Ooh, Madam Wong.
No, she had a healthy market. Mrs. Gooch. She was around.
Oh, Mrs. Gooch, yes.
Yeah.
She was the forerunner to Whole Foods.
Yeah, exactly. Way forerunner. It's on Sentinel. The property, it was on Sentinel in Culver City. Anyway, I worked there for a year. Again, I was a fish out of water. The ranch was in Santa Barbara.
Yeah, but you were gaining a lot of information that you would later use for yourself.
Oh, absolutely. And particularly, I consider Maury Gettleman, who was my boss at Fedco, I consider him to be my mentor. Certainly my father was a mentor to me, but he was a father mentor. And Maury really taught me that pennies turned into nickels and nickels turned into dimes.
Well, we're going to address that in one actual break time moment, because Richard, our inimitable engineer, has given me the high sign. Rich, are we out now?
Not yet.
Not yet?
You need to say, we'll be back.
Oh, I need to say we'll be back in just a few short moments to the Mr. Restaurant Show with Bob Spivak. Bob's our guest today in our maiden voyage, and we're going to continue talking with Bob about the rest of his life and how he's been influenced by others to create his own great concept called the Grill on the Alley, the Daily Grill, Public School, amongst others. So we'll be right back with Bob in just a moment.
Okay. Ready to pick it up from there?
Okay, here we go. All right, welcome back. We're with Bob Spivak, the true Mr. Restaurant, and he's joining me, Will Knox, Mr. Restaurant, on the Jeremiah Higgins Show. Bob has been co-founder, chairman, past president, CEO for Grill Concepts, and we've been talking a little bit about Bob's history leading up to the true operation called Grill Concepts. So, Bob, you had a various, well, I wouldn't say nefarious, but you had quite a
Very
circuitous route, I'd say, to getting to your real basic love, which is owning and operating your own concept. So can you address that now as to how that truly came into your life? At what point did you get this idea, I want to do my own deal? How did that come about?
Let me just say that we left off at organic vegetables, and
right.
There was one job for another year, which was selling solar pool heaters, and I was kicking around and not getting anywhere, and but I had coached my son's Little League team, and on that team, there were two fathers, Mike Weinstock and Richard Shapiro, and they both were always questioning me about restaurants, and they were very interested in restaurants.
Did they have background?
They had both been quite successful in various businesses having nothing to do with restaurants. Mike Weinstock was in the family home security business, and Richard Shapiro was the first budget rent-a-car franchisee. So they had both made money, but they were kind of frustrated that they didn't have careers that they were, let's say, proud of other than the money they made, and they were enamored with restaurants. So, by the way, on that same team, Little League team that I coached at my son's was Eric Garcetti, who, as you all know, is mayor of Los Angeles right now, headed for India.
Soon to be Ambassador Garcetti.
Exactly. So I decided to get together with these two gentlemen, Richard and Mike, and talk about maybe they could support me in the restaurant business.
Did you have a concept in mind?
Well, I'll tell you in 1 second. We met at a restaurant at Sepulveda and Church Lane, and I described the concept that I thought was timely. And that is a very, very high-end American grill, much like the Tadich Grill in San Francisco and Musso and Frank's in Hollywood, with a New York style bar. And this was—
Now, hold on a second. New York style bar. What does that mean?
Just a very straightforward, old-time cash register, nothing on the back bar except bottles and glasses, bottles and glasses. That's what I preached, bottles and glasses. And you know, bartenders that were a little salty, but well-liked, but everything being very traditional. The bartenders wore white jackets and would wear white jackets. And
Really old school.
I described this whole thing to them. And this was during a time of great pretense in the restaurant business in Los Angeles.
Well, the business was just, is this in the early 80s?
Yeah, 1982.
Right at the renaissance of the restaurant business in Los Angeles.
Well, yes, but it was very pretentious. Michael's in Santa Monica had, you know, you couldn't ask for the dressing on the side when the chef wouldn't come out and say, you'll eat this dish the way I make it, or you'll go somewhere else. Michael's had, and Michael's a very fine restaurant, still open today. Michael's had made an art form out of.
You're talking about California cuisine and originated by Michael's.
How pretty the
restaurant.
place could be,
Right.
How pretty the place could be, how small the portions were, and how large the prices. And
Right.
Then there was a
Small
restaurant.
carrot can I eat?
There was a restaurant in West Hollywood named Mom Maison. Mom Maison was so pretentious they had their own unlisted phone number. You couldn't call, you couldn't get that number even if you wanted to unless you knew somebody. So I described the New York bar, the American grill, and totally non-pretentious in a very high visibility area where the answer is yes, what is the question? And the guest is always right. And they loved the idea. So by the end of the meeting, they were very, very excited about the possibility of doing this. Now, taking a step back, by the third job, the solar pool heaters, my wife and I had agreed to disagree, and we were separated on our way to divorce. I didn't have enough money for my own apartment, so I was living at my father's. During this time when I was describing this restaurant to Mike and Dick, I was living at my father's. What little money I was making all went to keep my family going. And now I described this restaurant. We shook hands on a deal that the three of us would be responsible for developing the concept. I would be responsible for finding the location, setting it up, opening the restaurant, running the restaurant, and they would be responsible for raising the money to do it. We shook hands on the deal, and now I'm living at my father's, getting divorced, the most difficult time of my life. We shook hands on the deal, and I got up in the restaurant to make a phone call, and as I walked through the dining room, I got stopped by this blonde woman who was sitting having lunch, who recognized me from junior high school. I hadn't seen her in 21 years.
Sounds like danger to me.
And somehow she remembered me, and she stopped me. She said, "Aren't you Bobby Spivak?" And I looked at her. I knew exactly who she was. I said, "You're Leslie Martin." And she says, "Well, I was." And after lunch, I sat down with her and her girlfriend. We talked for about an hour. I made an excuse to get her phone number. I called her, and that woman is my wife today. So on the day when I made the deal of my life, shaking hands on what became the grill on the alley in Beverly Hills, I also met the love of my life.
Well,
And
that is a real turning point, and I'm told by Dr. D that I got to go off for a second and do a commercial. We'll be right back with Bob Spivak and Mr. Restaurant. Stay tuned.
Will, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Bob.
You tell me, it's a 11:15. Where you want to go from here? I will talk about the grill
Bob,
next.
we've got about 15 more minutes with you on the air, so we're going to get into talking a lot more about your life and the restaurant, particularly the creation of the grill concepts business, which you started talking about. You left off with your engagement, not only in the business, but your engagement with your current wife, Leslie, who's been quite involved in your business decision-making, as all good wives are. I know my wife is extremely integral to my decision-making. And of course, you started now in a very entrepreneurial situation with 2 kids. You're divorced. You've now taken up with a lovely past love who you subsequently are engaged to, or are you married to her at this point? What's going on personally?
This is the very beginning, and she was not a lost love.
So you're launching a restaurant and a marriage.
Well, I'm launching a restaurant and a relationship.
Aha.
We had just started our relationship. We were not past lovers. We hardly knew each other, but somehow she remembered me. So January 31st, 1984, we'll move right along here. The Grill on the Alley opened its doors.
The Grill on the Alley, now, for those who don't know, was probably the coolest place in all of Los Angeles, right off Rodeo Drive. You'd step down 3 or 4 steps, and you're in this remarkable haven that was just a power lunch and dinner spot, correct?
Well, it turned out to be. That wasn't exactly.
That wasn't your original vision?
Well, my original vision was to have a good restaurant, but to become a power restaurant in the movie industry was not something that I aspired to at all. As a matter of fact, I didn't know one star from the other. I'm the guy that called Robert Mitchum Mr. Douglas when he walked through the door.
Oh, that went over well.
Yeah, really. I didn't know the difference between one and the other.
But you were the counterpoint to Ma Maison, which was this delicate French restaurant that had this little known chef, Wolfgang Puck, and you were the opposite side of that coin, right?
That is correct. That is correct. We always said that the answer is yes. What is the question? The guest is always right, even when they're wrong. We're just there to please the guest. I will take a detour here and tell you that I found the space. You mentioned that it was 3 steps down off of an alley. I found the space. The space actually had a front door on Wilshire Boulevard. But both my partners and myself felt that if we could somehow turn it around and open it from the door on the alley, that would give it a cachet that we were looking for.
Was it built out?
It was a sushi bar.
Ah.
It had originally been Bentley's Chop House, if you remember it from driving down.
And how much was this capitalized for?
$750,000.
$750,000, which today would be over $3-4 million to build it out.
Today it would cost $3.5 to $4 million to build.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. So
this is 1984 now.
I found it's 1982 when I found the location. We opened January 31st, 1984. But I'll tell you the story about the back entrance because the door opened into an alley. I went to the city to get a building permit, and the city turned me down. Said that you cannot use that door for a public entrance because it opens into an alley. Well, I had kicked around a lot by this time. I told you the story, and this was, I felt my big chance, and I felt it was necessary. So I went to the building department. I pulled the plot maps out and found out that there was 3/4 of an inch of frontage on Dayton Way before the building went down the alley. So I went to the hardware store and I bought a domestic mailbox. I came back and the store next door to me was 9562 Dayton Way. So I made up the address of 9560 Dayton Way, painted it on the mailbox, hung it on the 3/5 of an inch wall, went to the post office, mailed myself a letter. In those days, they canceled the stamp with a
Hand stamp.
They couldn't reuse it. So I took the letter with the address 9560 Dayton Way with the cancel step into the building department and got a building permit immediately. So that's how the grill became the grill on the alley. So we'll fast forward a little bit. Will, you said it, the grill became just extremely well-known, extremely exciting restaurant. In 1993, it was inducted into the nation's Restaurant News Fine Dining Hall of Fame. We had notoriety that just went on and on.
Had you done the Daily Grill?
Well, so about 1989, 5 years later, I decided that I wanted to do something more. And so I went to my partners and I had the idea of building a downscale version of the grill, a more popularly priced version of the grill, with the same principles that the answer is yes, what is the question, where the guest is always right, but much more austere. The build out was more austere. The menu, where at the grill we served prime steaks, at the Daily Grill we served high-end Angus choice steaks. And there were scales of economy all the way along the line.
Well, I grew up in San Francisco and it reminded me of my favorite restaurant, which was called Joe's. And that's what I thought it was very reminiscent of. And it made me feel very much at home.
It was reminiscent of Joe's, although much more modern.
Right.
So it was just to have a popularly priced grill. By that time, we were extremely well known from the grill. And so when we opened the doors, there was a line down the stairs and down the block to get in. It was really, it was unbelievable mania of people that wanted to come to this restaurant.
And this is 1989.
It's 1980. I think it was 1988, actually.
Got it.
It was the year that Kirk Gibson hit the home run that was heard around the world. Because
I think that was that 89 or 88?
I think
88. Yeah.
I think it was 88.
Yeah.
Because that happened while I was working at the Daily Grill. So being a baseball fan, I never got to see that.
I was at that game.
Oh yeah, it was pretty exciting.
It was great.
So,
even though I hate the Dodgers. What's your favorite team?
Yeah, of course. I'll tell you one quick anecdote about what we went through. There was about an hour wait for a table, sometimes more than that, but basically an hour. And one day, Lou Ferrigno, who was the Hulk,
Yes.
the guy, he came in with his wife. And the hostess said there'll be an hour wait. We didn't take reservations. And so his wife started a little bit of a scene. And so I came over to see what was going on. And she says, my husband's Lou Ferrigno. He's a star and he can't wait an hour for a
I'm getting the high sign from Dr. D. Make it quick.
And he can't wait for a table. And I said, well, look, we just take them as they come. I can't do anything about that. So he waited and he waited. And I said, oh, but you know what? It's immediate seating at the counter. She said, my husband's Lou Ferrigno. He can't be seen sitting at the counter.
That's my favorite seat.
I said, you know what, Miss Ferrigno? Over there on the corner, there's 2 seats right next to Tom Hanks and his wife. This is a true story. And she said, well, he can't sit at the counter. So the end of this story is I went over to Tom and I said, you know, you're not going to believe this. And I told him the story. And I says, Lou Ferrigno's wife refused to sit at the counter next to you. And Tom says, yeah, but Lou, he's a big star. So that was my Daily Grill story.
All right, we're going to cut out on that now. Is that right, Dr. D? Do you want me to go out? And we're going to take a break and we're going to come right back with Bob Spivak and continue. There's a few more questions I want to ask Bob. So on we go. You're listening to Mr. Restaurant.
We'll take the remaining time to talk about, you know, the expansion of the Daily Grill.
Correct.
Grill and opening a public school.
You want to close the show?
Okay, Bob, when I get on this last segment, which will be how many more minutes do you figure, Dr. D?
You got 10 minutes.
We got 10 more minutes, Bob. So I'll cue you a little bit when we're winding down.
Okay.
But we're going to talk about the ascent and descent of grill concepts and some other things that you would suggest people do with their lives if they want to enter the restaurant business. And we'll talk a little bit about public school.
Ready?
We're ready to go.
All right, here we go.
Here we go. 1, 2. We're on. We're back with Bob
Okay,
Spivak, the
so,
original Mr. Restaurant.
Well, we were just talking about the Daily Grill and the success of that. And with
Yes.
that, we had decided that we wanted to open up more Daily Grills. So we opened the second one at Los Angeles and Beverly, right across the street from where my father had a restaurant, actually.
How ironic was that?
Pardon me?
How ironic was that?
Yeah, it was great. It gave me a great feeling to know that my father had passed away by then, but you know, he was a wonderful man, and he left me something greater than any money that he didn't have, and that was that there was never a time when my father wasn't proud of me, and I carried that with me all through my life. So we opened up the second one at Los Angeles Beverly, the third one in Newport Beach, fourth one in Encino, the fifth one in Studio City, and the sixth Daily Grill in Palm Desert. So by this time we have 6 Daily Grills and
only one grill on the alley.
Only one grill in the alley at this time. And things started to unravel. You know, I told you that I had a really lack of an education, and I really was not sophisticated enough to run a company that runs restaurants.
But you were the CEO, correct?
CEO, but I was a restaurateur, not necessarily a businessman. But when you get into 6, 7 restaurants, you need to have some more business behind you. And that's when I hired Chuck Frank, who was an accountant CPA, who had made a lot of money with another restaurant chain that he was partners in, and I hired him.
He's from Northern California.
He's from Northern California. He would fly down here twice a month to spend a day with me, and he really taught me how to run a restaurant company, a company that runs restaurants, not these specific restaurants. And so with that, I was able to grow the company. The 7th Daily Grill was in Irvine, California, and then the big move. We went cross country and we opened the 8th Daily Grill in Washington, D.C.
Wait a second. Why'd you go so far and leapfrog from LA to Washington, D.C.? Was there something really romantic and sexy about that?
Well,
that's a big leap.
Well, Washington, D.C. was romantic for me, but the real reason was that you know, we were looking to either go public, raise a lot of money, or possibly sell the concept ultimately. And we needed to prove that it wasn't just a Southern California concept. Washington, D.C. has the demographics that were very similar to Los Angeles. It has a lot of residential areas that have a lot of commerce as well, so that you know, lunch business for restaurants comes from office buildings. Dinner business and restaurants come from residential. And in LA, you certainly have residential and office all mixed together, like in Brentwood.
But operationally, putting the team together and flying across country, was that daunting?
Yes and no. For me, there was no difference between a 5-hour flight to Washington, D.C. and a 1-hour flight to San Francisco, when you had to get on a plane, when you had to, you know. So the fact that it was Washington, D.C. wasn't daunting at all. And also, we had a very valued general manager, Bill Shriver, who was from Baltimore and knew the D.C. area. And we moved him back there, and he ran that division. And that actually, truth be known, the Washington, D.C. Daily Grill was the highest volume Daily Grill in the company at that time.
So then, Bob, tell me what happened. You went public shortly thereafter with only one grill on the alley and 7 public, not public schools, but
Daily Grills.
Daily Grills, sorry.
There was one more grill on the alley. Lou Wolf, a very high net worth individual, owned the Fairmont Hotel in San Jose, and he made us an offer that we couldn't refuse. I didn't want to do any more of the grills. I felt it was one of a kind restaurant, but it was just an offer we couldn't refuse. And so we opened the grill on the alley at the Fairmont Hotel in San Jose, which also was a big success. So then raising money, the restaurant business is very, very, very capital intensive, and it's very difficult. You can't. It's really difficult to get bank loans because there's just not a lot of equity. You being in the real estate end of restaurants understand that better than most, but there's just not a lot of collateral that you can put up that a bank would be interested
It's all private money that goes into it. It's very risky, very highly leveraged.
We did a reverse merger. We merged with a very small public company. We were the successor of it, survivor of it. And all of a sudden, I found myself as the president, CEO of a public restaurant company. And we grew. We ended up with 23 daily grills across the country, and 7 grill in the alleys across the country. And the grill in the alleys stretched from Los Angeles to San Jose to Chicago and Florida, South Florida. And then, if you remember Sarbanes-Oxley, which was a government program that
Congressional
put a
program.
lot of restraints on small public companies, and it really got to be too expensive to be a public company. And so we found somebody to take it private.
And that's really where you departed.
Much later, but yes,
Which of course we have to do in about a minute, I'm told. So unfortunately,
I sold most.
drag. I'm just getting into it with you.
Yeah, I sold most of my stock to the gentleman who took it private, although I still was a substantial equity holder. And I retired. I was 63 years old.
Well, I hate that word retirement. So now what are you doing with your life?
Oh, it's just wonderful. It's just wonderful.
Are you advising, consulting?
I advise. I don't love consulting, but I advise. I work with a couple of charities. I'm really busy, but I'm really busy doing exactly what I like doing, and I have a wonderful life.
Well, I think you've earned it because now you're married to Leslie, your childhood sweetheart.
We've been together 40 years, and my final words to you, will be that I'm proud of my story, coming from learning disabilities and barely graduated from high school to be able to have the career I had. And I don't take it lightly, and nowhere else but the restaurant business could somebody with the lack of education do as I was able to.
Well, I will also say that you have to have a passion for the business to succeed. And you certainly demonstrate that. You've been at it, not because of necessity, but because you truly loved it. And anybody who starts the way you did and then ends up the way you did has a lot to be very, very not only grateful for, but proud of. So what would you suggest to a young person today who wants to own and operate? You know, everybody's out there. I got an idea for a restaurant with no walls and no lights and X, Y, and Z and no food. But what would you suggest to somebody today?
Get a job in a restaurant. Find out what the restaurant business is all about. Work in the kitchen, work in the dining room, find out what so many people get in it for all the wrong reasons. If you get in it because your mother was a good cook, that's not a good reason.
Or grandma's recipe.
You like the glad handing aspect of greeting people at the door, that's a bad reason to get in the business.
Or meet your spouse or your girlfriend, your boyfriend, whatever.
Yeah, but if you like being part of something exciting and you know, if you love what you're doing, if you love the work you're doing, you never work a day in your life. But you have to be a team member, true? Yeah, you got to have that attitude when you get in the restaurant business that you love it. Team is a big word. I could go on and on about team building, which I think we did a great job on. But maybe after you have 30 guests, you'll have me back and we'll finish. No, I'm going to have you back, certainly, because there's a lot more to the Bob Spivak story, and you are truly Mr. Restaurant. And I'm very, very touched that you are my first guest on this maiden voyage that we call Mr. Restaurant. So thank you very much, Richard. Are we good?
you want to stay with Mr. Spivak for a couple more seconds, or are we wrapping it up? Well, I guess that's the finale. So I'd love to have a dessert with you one time where we could really kind of finish up and have a little bit more, because there's more to the story about grill concepts and how it went so flying high, and then it languished, and today there's not as many as we would like to have. And certainly you have a great concept you created called Public School that originated in LA, and that's a gastropub, and it seemed to be a younger version for the younger generation of those who really would embrace great kind of bar food. So I'd love to talk about Public School and more about Bob Spivak at a later time, but I'm very, very touched that I've got the true Mr. Restaurant, Bob Spivak, on my show, Mr. Restaurant. This is Will Knox saying goodbye for now. I'll see you on the 19th hole or in the purpleness of my grotto someday. But welcome to my show, and hopefully there will be many more. And Bob, again, many, many thanks for being here.
Thanks, Will.
Appreciate
Bye-bye.
it very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bob, we're clear? Bob?
Okay.
Hey.
No live mic faux pas.
Oh, no. And what made it a little bit more difficult for me was that